Good afternoon, dear friends. Today I would like to represent you my presentation Introduction to Pharmacovigilance, History and Overview. Several words about myself. My name is Galina Cordera. I'm qualified person of pharmacovigilance, GCK, Pharmac, Ukraine. Why it's very important in these days and actuality of this situation. What we can see that reality can dictate for us and COVID problems and problems which meet every day medical doctor, pharmacist and pharmaceutical industry. It's now pharmacovigilance. Everybody has dream, and my dream it's make pharmacovigilance school which will be represent and cover and describe in cases pharmacovigilance problems, drug safety problems of medical errors, problems of clinical what we meet now. It's role pharmacovigilance and clinical experience and clinical knowledge. Several words about my new plans. It's describing in my new programs, which will divided on modules included clinical parts and parts covered regulatory questions. Right now I'm working on improving my module program, and I will represent it in my group in LinkedIn, Clinical Regulatory Pharmacovigilance, and in GVP group, Pharmacovigilance, GVP Pharmacovigilance group. Everything starting from some small steps, and the road to success included small steps for success too. I want now to represent my new Module 1, Introduction to Pharmacovigilance, History and Overview. Pharmacovigilance has long story, and as a party, its story included cases with death of patient. As we know, that main purpose of pharmacovigilance is safety of patient. Main objectives which I want to get in this representation, it's reflect question covering introduction, defining pharmacovigilance, terminology and definition in pharmacovigilance, and modern history of pharmacovigilance. What we can see is that question of pharmacovigilance was reflected, and this question was actual and before, and I want to stop it on Jean-Baptiste Molière. To undergo treatment, you have be very healthy, because apart for your sickness you have stand the medicine, because everybody we know that majority of problems can be connected and related with overdose problems, with problems of abuse, and we will reflect it and discuss in my lectures too concerning on question of pharmacovigilance. Pharmacovigilance. This point was starting from some activities, and pharmacovigilance undergo long way, as we described it before, from routine pharmacovigilance and to proactive pharmacovigilance, what we see right now, and thankful for activity of Prague and MHRA and regulatory authorities, all countries, we get success. And what I see from my previous experience, that pharmacovigilance, it's not just activities, it's science. And why it's important now, position in pharmacovigilance and pharmacovigilance scientist, this person who has scientific background, who has clinical experience. Why? Because majority problems now are related with clinical question. It's very important to divide meaning between for example, adverse events, adverse reaction, and signs of disease. And why now I consider it's important right now that pharmacovigilance specialists should have clinical experience. And from my previous experience, that it's very important because, for example, working with risks and working with risk minimization measure, it's very important too. It's why this pharmacovigilance has been defined by the World Health Organization, that it's the science and activities related to the detections, assessment, understanding, and prevention of adverse effects of any other possible drug-related problems. The magnitude of adverse reaction globally, it's a very important now problem too, because adverse events due to unsafe care is likely one of the 10 leading causes of death and disability globally. Its higher income countries is estimated that 1 in every 10 patients is harmed while receiving hospital care. The harm can be caused by a range of adverse events, with nearly 50% of them being preventable. What we see now that it's related not just problems with health problems, death problems, it's and financial problems. Each year, 134 million adverse events occur in hospitals in low and middle income countries due to unsafe care, resulted in 2.6 million deaths. As we know that safety of patient is very important, what we should do now, what I see now, it's working on trainings for medical doctors, for pharmacists, and may change it accent. Why? Because, for example, in clinical pharmacologists main accent making on efficacy of drug, of using of drugs, of mechanism of working of this drug, but many problems now related in different area, because problems of polypragmasia, problems with medical errors, overdose, and drug-drug interaction, drug-drug interaction, for example, with food, and drug interaction with medical device. This question we will cover in my lectures too. Pharmacovigilance in pediatric population, in special population, and older population. Problems with problems with for example, as we know that in different population drugs working differently. We can see it on cases, for example, beta adrenal blockators and blockators of F receptors, and we see that for example in Caucasians and in black people, evidence of these adverse events can be different and efficacy can be different. With some articles shows, for example, that efficacy of some group of drugs can be just 70%. It's depend on from problems, genetic problems, genetic polymorphism problems, and this question is very deep. We will describe in our lectures too. Now talking about magnitude of adverse reaction globally, we can use dates of meta-analysis of hospital studies in United States, and studies estimate that 6.7% of hospitalized patients have a serious and serious fatal adverse estimated to be fourth leading cause of death in hospitalized patients. I won't pay attention that fourth leading cause of death in hospitalized patient is fatal adverse events, and it's taken into account control in hospitals. It's why very important for medical doctor to get this knowledge, to refresh this knowledge, and maybe now time to tell sincerely that it's time to open this and look on pharmacovigilance like a new separate subject, and start learn it in medical universities by students, learn it by pharmacists, because majority drugs and medicines now patient can buy in pharmacies too. And this knowledge and awareness, pharmacovigilance awareness, should have every medical doctor, nurse, and pharmacist. It's very important nowadays. Estimated cost of adverse events is over 30 billion annually in the United States alone. The National Institute for Health and Care Excellence United Kingdom meta-analysis shows that health and medical implication of adverse events, pooled data March 2022, adverse reaction experienced by 8% of patients receiving primary care. The incidence of hospitalization in children due to adverse reactions estimated at 3%. The incidence of hospitalization in the elderly due to adverse reactions estimated at 8.7%. The overall impact of adverse reaction in England was 4 out of 100 hospital bed days, equivalent to 15 to 20 400 bed hospital. It's days as we see from National Institute for Health and Care Excellence, NICE. And we see that it's outdated new dates. When we're talking about importance of pharmacovigilance in the drug life cycle, new products information collected during the post-marketing phase are incomplete. Animal tests are insufficient as predicted human safety. And we see, for example, that some drugs, it's enough to stop life cycle and circulation drugs in market, even adverse reaction in non-clinical stage 2. It's why when we will be talking about main risk on all stage of life cycle, we will talk about and problems and R&D problems, how to use molecule and how work with it afterwards. It's R&D problems concerning on and it's go under GMP problems because we will talk about now we see that GVP very related not just with safety problems on post-authorization but in previously stage, and very connected while we're talking about GXP inspection and involving exactly involving to GVP field 2. In clinical trials, patients are selected, are limited in number, and as we know that some adverse events can appear just in post-authorization, post-marketing phase. Why? Because not enough population in clinical trials, and as we know, in clinical trials are present indicator including and excluding criteria. It's why, for example, pregnant women not reflected in clinical trials, pediatric population, some diseases are excluded. It's in problems with oncologists and other disease, for example, heart disease, problems with kidneys, and chronic disease, and it's very important too. Information about rare but serious adverse reaction. Chronic toxicity used in special groups, children, elderly, or pregnant women, is often incomplete too, and we talked about it already. What now? Limitation of pre-approval clinical trials. We will talk about more precisely comparatively small population, maximum 3,000, 5,000 subjects, sometimes larger for vaccines. Narrow population with carefully selected inclusion-exclusion criteria often does not include special groups, children, elderly. Narrow use with defined administration and indication, not covering actual and evolving use in real-world clinical practice. Short duration, 1-3 years treatment and follow-up observation, and latent effects not directly measured. We know that some effects can appear not just after administration of drug, but and later than 1-3 years, if we know about these drug reactions too. For example, when we're talking about limitation of pre-approval clinical trial, carefully selected subjects may not reflect real-life patients in whom drug will be admitted. Study subjects may receive better care and closer observations than real-life patients, and again, short duration of treatment. It's now very important too. Study size. Studies with 3,000 patients cannot reliably detect adverse events with incidence unless 1 in 1,000, even in severe, if it's severe. Studies with 500 patients cannot reliably detect adverse events incidence of less 1 in 146, even if it's severe too. Consequences of limitation of pre-approval trials. About 20% of drugs get new black box warning after marketing. About 4% of drugs ultimately withdrawn for safety reasons. it's now important too. Pharmacovigilance mandatory for every country. Difference between countries, even region with the same country. It can be difference in drug production, it can be difference in drug distribution, use, choice, indication, or dose, in genetic diets, traditions of people, in the composition, excipients, or quality of locally produced drugs. Traditional local remedies may raise special toxicology problems if we will talk about in our lectures too, because these points are very important when we are talking about drug safety problems and using in different stage of life cycles of medicines. Main business objectives when we're talking about pharmacovigilance in the pharmaceutical industry, it's minimize risk for patients, minimize risk for company, meet global regulatory requirements, full compliance, prolong life cycle of products, and provide competitive advantage. Major aims of pharmacovigilance: early detection of hitherto unknown adverse reaction interaction, identification of risk factors and possible mechanism underlying adverse reaction. It's very interesting problems in clinical pharmacovigilance, which covered not just problems with new drugs, but we know, for example, hydrolazine drug, yes, and these problems with cancer, which can be appear when it's long use drugs, and factor of risk in this situation, it's photosensibilization, and I think that it's more factor risk presented in those where sun light and more activity, and this risk will be what doing rising. Estimation of quantitative aspects of benefit risk analysis and dissemination of information needed to improve drugs prescribing and regulation. What it aims of pharmacovigilance? The identification and quantification of previously underrecognized adverse effects and reactions, the identification of subgroups of patients and particular risk of adverse reaction, the continuous surveillance of products throughout the duration of its use to ensure that the balance of its benefits and harms are and remain acceptable. The description of the comparative adverse reaction profile of products within the same therapeutic class, the detection of inappropriate prescription and administration, the first elucidation of a product pharmacological and toxicological properties and the mechanism by which it produces adverse effects. Main steps of pharmacovigilance. Step 1 is the collection of reports about the adverse effects and all adverse reactions of the drugs. All adverse reactions, including serious and unexpected effects, are subjected to expedited reporting. Step 2 involves receiving the cumulative reports regarding the safety of drugs and sending those reports of all regulatory authorities. Step 3. The process of determining the specific adverse effects associated with a specific drug and then comparing this drug with another drug having a similarly worse effect. Management of adverse effects of the drugs, receiving information regarding the harmful effects of patient or population and seek a method of minimize these effects. Majority question I receiving about definition, because medical doctors, not everybody understand difference between adverse drug reaction and adverse event. Adverse event is any untoward medical occurrence that may present during treatment with pharmaceutical product, but which does not necessarily have a causal relationship with this treatment. It means that not necessarily have a causal relationship with treatment and appearing this adverse event. Plus, I can add that adverse event, it can be not just negative consequences of medical administration, medical using of drugs. For example, some of drugs, it's like sildenafil, main purpose was lung hypertensivity problems in patient, but afterwards, and we know it, that main indication became its exactly sexual dysfunction in men, because previously it was adverse event, and clinical researchers, medical doctors, and afterwards in post-authorization phase, this effect became indications. And for example, drugs like the caries, this drug's main purpose and main indication was like antiparasitic drugs. Afterwards was founded immunomodulator effect too. It's why very important in every stage of clinical development of the drugs, and including post-authorization phase, monitoring all adverse events. It can be positive or it can be negative, and negative adverse events with necessary causal relationship, and every time, all time, and everywhere it's negative reaction and negative input for health of patient. It's why adverse drug reaction is a response to a medicine, to drug, which is noxious and unintended, and which occurs at doses normally used in humans, and with necessary causal relationship and negative input for health. Now we see this difference, and we can see this difference in slides, how related definition adverse drug events, adverse drug reactions, and medical errors. Medical errors can be reasons of appearing adverse reaction. It's now big problems, and we will talk about very carefully and attentively in some lectures, which will be very actual, exactly for medical doctor, not just who are working in hospital, but who has own practice, who working in polyclinics, physician, and specific medical doctors like surgery, gynecologists. Why? Because, for example, from my experience, it's related with diagnostic drugs, iodine containing drugs, and for diagnostic drugs, from my previous experience, medical doctor did not pay attention for attentively preparation of patient to this procedure, MRT, magnetic resonance therapy, and afterwards it was this drugs is concentrated liquid, and when patient has endothelial dysfunction, for example, if we're talking about pathology, is hypertensive disease, is ischemic disease of heart or problems with heart, is lungs hypertensive disease and problems with vessels, because we know these problems with endothelial dysfunction, it can be related with typical pathologist condition, for example, ischemia and tissue hypoxia. This group of patients has big big ratio of risk exactly related with iodine containing X-ray drugs, which this group of patients must be prepared with hydration, because it minimize risk of appearing this drugs reaction. And what I plan in my lectures is discuss exact case with patient, and I will be very thankful, for example, for hot discussion in these lectures. Why? Because after every lectures I won't communicate in with medical doctors and to hear their feedback. Why it's important? Because it will help for myself to find out new needs and what topics will be very important for medical doctors, healthcare professionals, and for me it will be help minimize risks of appearance adverse events too. I think we on beginning, and I will be thankful for hot work together, because what I want that patient don't die after using medicines which from medical errors, from overdose, from risk. As a party, just 50% of medical doctors read outdated SMPC and have knowledge about updated safety profile of drugs, of medicines. Pharmacovigilance specialists know it because we generate special documents, risk management plans, periodic safety update reports, where in risk management plan we identify risk and working on risk minimization measures and control of efficacy these measures. Not enough just for example, generate these measures, but question how control efficacy. And in periodic safety update report, we are, as a pharmacovigilance specialist, we talking and describing ratio, benefit risk ratio of drugs. Now we go to definition and adverse events more precisely, and when we see an adverse event definition in ICH 2D CGVP Annex 4 as it's any untoward medical occurrence and patient administration and medicinal products, and which does not necessarily have to have a causal relation with the treatment. I want that you remember it 2 points again. Adverse events has no a causal relations with the treatment. It can be positive, has positive input exactly for patient's health. For example, and we talked about this group of drugs. Comparing adverse events and adverse reaction. An adverse reaction, in contrast of adverse events, is characterized by the fact that, again, causal relations between a medicine, a product, and occurrence is suspected. For regulatory reporting purposes, in the event is spontaneously reported, even if the relation is unknown or unstated by the healthcare professional or consumer as primary source, it meets the definition of an adverse reaction, see GVP Annex 4, ICH A2D. Therefore, all spontaneous reports notified by healthcare professionals or consumers are considered suspected adverse reactions, since they convey the suspicions of the primary sources, unless the primary source specifically states that they believe the event to be unrelated or that a causal relationship can be excluded. Talking about comparative adverse events and adverse reaction, again, for example, adverse events, it's not necessarily causally related. Adverse drug reaction, it's suspected causal relations. And we're talking a very important look surrounding, and even we're talking about adverse events, what can make input for adverse events, which factors, its diseases, its environment, its genetics, and we talking about genetic polymorphism. It's very deep topic right now. Its compliance, its diet, it can be other agents we can find out when we're talking about adverse event. Unexpected therapeutic benefit from adverse reaction, it can be happen it's when we're talking about adverse event. Abnormal growth, hyperthyroisis of eyelashes induced by prostamid is prostaglandin groups or synthetic prostaglandin F2A analogs like for example, bimatoprost. This class of drugs is used for increases intraocular pressure of glaucoma. For cosmetic purposes, the adverse drug effect of hypertrichosis has been turned into a new indication, eyelash hypertrichosis. It's more cosmetics problems, but it can be problems with, for example, not convincing conditions, and this group of drug of medicines can be used in new indication, eyelash hypertrichosis. New indication is a platelet aggregation inhibition of aspirin, acetylsalicylic acid, used as analgesic, causing increased bleeding tendency, using two. When we're talking about this group, I won't talk about paracetamol right now. Reye syndrome is very now often used in population because this drug and COVID problems, pandemic problems, and problems with viruses, for example, which we met and use it in some countries, it's still used in pediatric population, overdose and often used in pediatric. It's three factors can be raised incidence and frequency of syndrome Reye with hepatotoxicity in this population, to be very careful with this group, and please read SMPC, a patient leaflets where described all adverse events too, and please use medicine just according SMPC in patient's leaflet. No variation, no how explain variation with using, because new combination of drugs that patient can allow for using can be reason of adverse reaction. It can be even reason of death. Examples of adverse drug reaction. It's common and well established in adverse reaction. We know these groups. It's constipation with opioids, abdominal pain and diarrhea with erythromycin therapy, nausea when starting fluoxetine, gastrointestinal symptoms with nesteroid drugs, and this group we will describe very attentively because we can meet new interesting information which can be useful for medical doctors too, because this group is often administered for patients in different pathological conditions too. Uncommon but well recognized adverse reaction is Achilles tendonitis caused by quinolone antibiotics. It's new risk I can tell because influences on and because it's not just problems with tendinitis but problems, for example, in such condition like prolongation of mitral valves and other problems, visual field defects with vigabatrin. It's two very important adverse drug reaction too. Uncommon emerging adverse reaction and examples of it: depression with, for example, rimonabant, atrial fibrillation with bisphosphonates, and hepatotoxicity with lumiraxasib. It's a new group of drugs, and be careful too, because when new group of drugs come in the markets, it should be active monitoring of adverse effects, and looking if it's an adverse reaction, and it can become signal, it can become risk. We will talk about definition, what means signal, what means risk, what difference between it, and afterwards what doing pharmacovigilance specialists and drug safety specialists. It's working about risk minimization measures and then control it, because in the result of every risk minimization measure should be, and we know it, decreased frequency of drugs reaction, adverse reaction. It's decreased frequency, severity, and seriousness. And severity, seriousness is two different meaning too. We will talk about it too. Preventable adverse reaction. What group this includes? This group include medication errors, intentional abuse or misuse, unintentional misuse, unintentional overdose, unintended occupational exposure, and drug quality problem. Asepity can be two problems of adverse drug reaction, and we know is that every factory, every company now, pharmaceutical company working according GMP, good manufacturers requirements, but still it can be cause adverse reaction, drug quality problems. And when we're talking about pharmaceutical industry in this meaning, in this case, we're talking about the strictly relationship between qualified person of pharmacovigilance QPPV and qualified person who is responsible for quality, and it will be talking of regulatory part of pharmacovigilance lectures, how work with this problem, how should be interaction between qualified person of pharmacovigilance and between qualified person of quality, what kind of standard operation procedure should be, and how it's really be working, because it's really a live process and 24/7 process. It's why very important to be online 24 hours 7 days for qualified person of pharmacovigilance and qualified persons for quality too. It's why right drug, right dose, right time, right education and right monitoring. What we see what can be factors and instruments for preventability of adverse drug reaction. Again, it's right drug, right dose. It's meaning that everybody should use medicines, drugs according SMPC or patient leaflet, not using drugs that it's not reflected in SMPC. Right dose without overdose, because plus included possible drug indication. Right time, it can be before your meal or after meal. It's reflected in SMPC or patient leaflet too. Right education. It's why I would like to open this program of lectures and afterwards it's be school of safety, use and administration of drug, when we can independently discuss every problems and your experience every pharmacovigilance specialist can be useful for minimize frequency, severity and seriousness of drugs reaction, and we will see result. It's why we should have knowledge, and not just knowledge, we should use this knowledge in our practical activities every day. And right monitoring of adverse events, why we use we will talk about methods of monitoring of adverse events and role of literature research, role of medical doctors, pharmacists. Every patient can be reason of adverse events too, and how work with these adverse events which can become adverse reaction. Adverse reaction can become signal can become risks. Risk can influence on ratio, benefit risk ratio, and it can be useful for medical doctors because and pharmaceutical industry specialists, exactly pharmacovigilance, drug safety specialists working on this risk together with regulatory authorities. If we see, for example, every month meetings, prac meetings, highlighting meetings, please follow it. We use new information concerning on safety and mature sites. We can see new information updated on FDA site and of Australian regulatory authority too. And when we combine this information, we can see, for example, you can meet that differently, for example, each for medical administration, medical use drug, but it can be connected with special specific clinical trials on pediatric population. And please follow clinical trial gov2 site, which you can follow new information concerning on clinical trials and what's new happen with drugs too. It's interesting work. It's why I won't make accent again that pharmacovigilance, it's not just activity, it's now science and activity, because first of all pharmacovigilance should be responsible for safety, on first place safety of patient first. Another question, it's readiness, inspectionist readiness for every pharmaceutical factory, for every pharmaceutical company for inspections. And we will talk about important system, main problems and main mistakes with the system, role of audit of pharmacovigilance system, and it will be parts of regulatory, exactly regulatory pharmacovigilance. When we are talking about individual case safety report ICCRs, individual case safety reports, this refers to the format and content for the submission of an individual report of suspected adverse reaction in relation to a medicinal product that occurs in single patient and specific point of the times. Very important for you and for everybody, pharmaceutical specialists, drug safety specialists, to understand what this means valid ICCR, individual case safety reports. Which criteria should be included in it? It's very easy to remember. To alive criteria, to not alive criteria. What mean alive criteria? Alive criteria included who reported, who source of report. For example, it can be medical doctor, it can be every healthcare professional, patient, it can be literature search source, or it can be register, or it can be clinical trial source too. It's alive criteria. Another alive criteria is patient information concerning on patient. Which disease, which diagnosis has patient, anamnesis of life, anamnesis of disease, very carefully, attentively collected. It's mean because it's very important afterwards to understand according to WHO criteria, Naranjo criteria, make causal relationship according criteria. And not alive criteria, it's exactly information about adverse reaction. It's what include what symptoms or what signs of this adverse reaction. It can be included and laboratory values of adverse events, full information. When appeared reaction, when finished reaction, what kind of medicines were used for stopped signs of this reaction, and what how finished this what kind of symptoms was finished this reaction. For example, it was total recovery, not total recovery. It's what some problems with health which patient has afterwards. It's all included in this unsafe, unalive criteria. And another criteria, it's first one, it's criteria concerning on medicine. What this mean? It's information covered what these drugs and for example by number of batch. And this full criteria should be included for criteria for validity of ICCR. What you should do with not valid ICCR, individual case safety report, you should collect it and have some base for it, because for example today this individual case safety report not valid, but tomorrow you can find your information, it's become valid. Again, what's important again, it's if you for example get this ICCR and you see that you need follow up, please don't stop and try to find additional information for follow up of this drug reaction. It's very important and I pay your attention. When now I want to summarize what I told before. Minimum criteria for valid ICCR, individual case reports. First, an identifiable reporter. It's who source of this adverse reaction. A single identifiable patient, thought a suspect medicinal product, and a suspect adverse reaction. We see 4 criteria. What we will do with another problems with safety of drugs, it's overdose, off-label use, and misuse. Overdose, this refers to the administration of the quantities of medicinal products given per administration or cumulatively which is above the maximum recommended dose according to the authorized product information. Clinical judgment should always be applied. Off-label use. This related to situation where the medicinal products is intentionally used for a medicinal purpose not in accordance with the terms of marketing authorization. Sometimes medical doctors administrate medical drugs not according SMPC, and they some medical doctors thinking that it's like science, but when pharmaceutical company working on clinical research of these drugs and then conduct non-clinical drugs, clinical trials, then it's all summarized in SMPC. It means that everything is in law. When medical doctor or pharmacist can give advice, for example, for administration for different indication, it can be reason of adverse events. Be very careful for use it, because when you will meet problems with patient, it will be your own responsibility and your consequences of your decision for prescribing or for administration this medicine. Please pay attention of problem of off-label use, and remember that it's your personal responsibility of making of this decision. Misuse. This refers to the situation where the medicinal product is intentionally and inappropriately used not in accordance with the terms of marketing authorization, and you should understand that it's your personal responsibility too. Abuse, occupational exposure, and medication error. Abuse. This corresponds to the persistent or sporadic intentional excessive use of a medicinal product which is accompanied by harmful physical or psychological effects. Occupational exposure. This refers to the exposure to a medicinal product, see definition and Annex 4. As a result of one's professional or non-professional occupation, it does not include the exposure to one of the ingredients during the manufacturing process before the release as a finished product. And main problem right now is medication error. This is an unintended failure in the drug treatment process that leads to or has the potential to lead to harm to the patient. And it will be a big part of lectures, big module of lectures with cases where we can discuss medicinal error. And please, some medical doctors, I'm medical doctor too. I have clinical experience too. I was working as a physician. I was working in scientific research university too, and as a clinical expert too. I see that the majority of doctors, physicians, and different specialists like surgeries and gynecologists, cardiologists, and others afraid it. But question is, when you don't find reason of this medicine error, as I can tell from my previous experience, it can be repeated, and again repeated, and it can be reason of death too of patient. You should work on it, you should read, you should not afraid, and be open, talk with pharmaceutical company too, because pharmaceutical companies now in majority of cases has maybe more knowledge about medicine products, medicine drugs, than even medical doctor, because now pharmacovigilance run, not now go ahead, it's run so quickly. And I think in future again it will be different subject separated from clinical pharmacology with this big volume on new drugs. It can be divided and like vigilance, pharmacovigilance drugs, vaccine vigilance, and device vigilance. But question is, it can be looks like separately, because some problems lay down drug-drug interaction, drug-device interaction, for example, or drug-vaccine interaction. And I think that as we go ahead, we will see new problems, new challenges, and we should solve it together. Medical doctors, pharmacists, and pharmaceutical industry. Everybody, we should take care about safety of patients. Please be open to discuss it with companies. Please be open to find new knowledge, because again pharmaceutical industry now has a lot of knowledge. Falsified medicine product is big problem too, and this related to any medicinal product with a false representation of its identity, including its packaging and labeling, its name of its composition as regards of any ingredients, excluding excipients and the strength of those ingredients, its source, including its manufacturers, its country of manufacturing, its country of origin of its marketing authorization holder, or its history, including the records and the documents related to the distribution channels used. This definition does not include intentional quality defects and is without prejudice to infringement or intellectual property rights. Please make difference in this meaning. History. History of pharmacovigilance is sad and starting from big tragedy of thalidomide. United States and these problems know every country, but majority problem had Europe, and United States did not allow to use thalidomide for pregnant women. And it's big lesson from history to collect information of safety profile and make decision taking into account exactly safety of patients first. These problems was related with huge problems, because thalidomide, this image above shows the two enantiomers of thalidomide. We see when we looking on chemical structure two enantiomer. Enantiomer is right and left thalidomide, and what we see that thalidomide S form enantiomer is teratogen. And question of it, why I pay your attention on it, can be reason and lay down an R&D and research problem. Main lessons learned from thalidomide. These problems was again in pregnant women, administration in pregnant women and kids of these women who take this drug had teratogenic problems, problems that kids were born without extremities, and majority of them died when they were young, but majority alive, and it's a big problem of invalidization of population in that time, and we should remember these lessons. Main lessons learned from thalidomide, this tragedy, the need for adequate testing of medicine prior to marketing, because not in that time it's not paid attention for testing for clinical trials before too, and now it's important part of clinical development of drugs, and we know is that pharmacovigilance in clinical trials, it's one of important part of clinical trials too. If, for example, you see clinical trial without adverse event, be very careful about it too, and try as a pharmacovigilance professional collect all information about it too. It's why very important to have need for adequate testing of medicine prior of marketing. The need for government regulations of medicines, the need for reporting system or to identify the adverse effects of medicines, the potential safety implication of improving marketing claims. Most medicines cross the placenta. This results in fetal exposure. It's very important to administrate medicines for pregnant women. Avoidance of unnecessary use of medicine in pregnancy, that some risks can be successfully minimized too, and we should understand it too. When we're talking about history of pharmacovigilance, the safety of patient was discussed first time in Biologists Control Act 1902 year was passed by United States, and I think the United States was pioneer in pharmacovigilance. After that, in 1962, United States promulgated a law stated that it's manufacturer's responsibility to prove safety and efficacy of the drug before getting marketing authorization. In 1963, a Committee of Safety of Drug was established in United Kingdom. In 1964, a system of yellow cards, and Great Britain now, as we remember, was a pioneer too in development and GVP. We remember it, and I remember it too when Europe just started thinking about GVP. Mediterranean, Great Britain was developing good pharmacovigilance practice and start working according to this requirement. And a system of yellow cards was established in the United Kingdom to trace, reporting safety of drugs by all users of drugs. By 1964-1965, National Adverse Drugs Reaction Reporting System was initiated in countries like United Kingdom, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, West Germany, and Sweden. This country now has very developed pharmacovigilance system too. Other significant lessons from history, including drug safety, pharmacovigilance problem, is gastrointestinal hemorrhage, steroids, other drugs, medicine, anticoagulants, glucocorticoids, other hemorrhage, cytostatics, anticoagulants, aplastic anemia, phenylbutazone, butadiene, cytostatic, acute and chronic liver damage, aminazine, niacin, tetracycline. We will talking about drug indicated liver leisure, liver injury, daily meaning terminology. It's now even how explain it's huge problem now to this drug indicated liver problems, liver injury, kidney damage. It's steroids, aminoglycoside, gentamicin, niacin, decreases resistance infections, cytostatics, corticosteroids, and we know this problem. Factors predisposing for adverse reaction. We should know it too. It's drug related can be factors. It's dosage form and delivery system, and interaction between drugs. And patient-related factors, it's age, pediatrically, elderly, special population, concurrent disease, hepatic disease, renal disease, other diseases, genetic factors, gender, race, ethnicity. Factor predisposing for adverse reactions, we are talking about age. The elderly and neonates are at greatest risk of development of adverse reactions. Gender, women are generally at higher risks. Ethnic origin can affect drug metabolism because of genetic predispositions. Impaired excretory mechanism, reduced hepatic and or renal function, specific diseases, asthma or beta blockers, polypharmacy, polypragmasia, use of multiple drugs simultaneously, increasing the potential for drugs interaction. And we will talk about next section, and it will be big module concerning on drug interaction, including drug-drug interaction, drug-device interaction, drug-food interaction, and I hope you will find new information. For example, if you have some needs of information, you can contact me, and I will prepare lectures for this topic, because I will investigate. I investigated already, have investigated already, but I can something miss, and I will be very thankful if you will help me. I will pay my attention that this problem is interesting for you, and you need this information and any previous history of an adverse reaction. We see that factor predisposing for adverse reaction too. And now I would like to reflect your development pharmacovigilance in cases. And first, what I want to pay your attention is situation with Proctolol. In early 1970s, another drug safety disaster occurred. This was the ocular mucocutaneous syndrome, a multi-system disorder caused by Proctolol, Araldin, and cardioselective beta blocker used to treat angina and hypertension. The fundamental problem in the instance was the failure of timely identification, as despite having an early warning system in place, this system was dependent on doctors suspecting an association between drugs and disease. Very important for medical doctor suspected association between drug and disease. And when we will talk about causality, I will organize a workshop with cases for medical doctors, and who interested in it, just let me know. If we will I will reflect you in my lectures, and we will discuss every case. You can ask me questions. It's be a live online lectures, and we can talk about every interested your question. Please work in it actively. It will make great input in your practical everyday activity. Probably because of the unusual nature of the syndrome, dry eyes, skin rash, and bowel obstruction, and a long latency period averaging almost 2 years in respect of the onset of the most serious of bowel manifestation, relevant cases were not reported until the association was identified in the medical literature. Why it's important, parallel with active monitoring of adverse effects, adverse reaction, make one time per 7 days according United States and European legislation, and one time per 7 and one time per 2 weeks, 14 days in Canada. Main lessons learned from Fractalol 2. Some adverse effects are not predictable from preclinical studies. Apathy. Spontaneous reporting is not always effective in identifying new adverse reactions. Health professionals may not be able to identify long latency effects and clinical manifestation not known to be related to other drugs and adverse reaction. Additional, proactive and more systematic methods of studying post-marketing safety are needed. The overreading from Proctalol was spontaneous, and reporting alone is insufficient as means of studying post-marketing safety. The basic idea was the initial user of new drugs will be identified through prescriptions and monitoring systematically rather than waiting for someone to recognize a possible adverse effects. Another case is benoxaprofen. The first drug studied by PAM in England was benoxaprofen Opren. It's non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs, NCH, which frequently produce photosensitivity reaction, rashes, and like exposed areas. A published case series from Northern Ireland of 5 deaths relating to hepatic and renal failure led to withdrawal of the drug in 1982. Also, the PAM study did not reveal any indication of these effects. Many of these patients who experienced serious adverse reactions with benoxaprofen were elderly. This was a result of reduced excretion of the drug as a consequence of renal impairment. Even though it is well recognized that many patients who use this non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drug reaction was not adequately studied in the population prior to marketing. It's a big problem too. A reduction in dosage recommendation for the elderly was implemented briefly, but benoxaprofen was withdrawn soon afterwards. We see how long it takes sometimes, which problems we can meet in it too. Because the usage of benoxaprofen took off rapidly after launch, and an important adverse effect, photosensitivity reaction, was common, a large number of spontaneous reports were received in short period of time swamping the primitive computer systems in user and pointed to the need for purpose designed database. It was stimulated this case of development of database. We know it the database it must be, and it must be validated database for collected and for management ICCRs in pharmaceutical companies and pharmacovigilance, and QPPV, qualified person of pharmacovigilance, is personal responsibility to know version of validity of this database, to have full information of database. And when we will talk about pharmacovigilance system, I will reflect it in general question and very carefully, very attentively in lectures which will be according requirements of adversary of databases. Plus I will show different types of database, pluses and minuses, and what you should pay attention if you are pharmacovigilance specialist, and your own responsibility if you QPPV or pharmacovigilance manager or your deputy QPP. We will talk to the point about this information concerning all databases. If we will come back to the case of benoxaprofen, this issue also illustrated the need for patients to be properly informed about possible adverse reaction and how to minimize the risk. It's make pharmacovigilance more proactively. What we now see now, that pharmacovigilance has proactive character. In this case, but avoiding exposure to the sun. It was therefore influential in moving towards the introduction of patient information leaflets, which became compulsory in the European Union during the 1990s. History of pharmacovigilance has many cases, and we will talk about it in our lectures concerning on adverse reaction. Thank you for information, and I think that we will talk about our cases, about pharmacovigilance, drug safety problems, and in our future lectures. Thank you very much. I will be thankful for your feedback, and please write me and give me full information about